90% of claims within 40 working days. If I can just give you some numbers in terms of the performance so far, and I'm very happy to hand over to Carl.
And while you do, could you just give us the numbers of people in the 555 group who were convicted and those who were non-convicted? Because actually we have struggled as a committee to put that information together from public sources.
I think that's 63 that were convicted.
That's correct, yes, exactly. 63 of the 555 had convictions. 47 of the 555 have had compensation through the arrangements that the Post Office are leading on compensating those with overturned convictions. And the amount of money that has gone to that group of 47 people is 17 million so far, and there is more to come.
Okay, so we've got a long way still to go. Okay, Mr. Pawsey.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, if I can just go backwards first, and can I first of all say thank you for spending your time this morning listening to all of the evidence. It's very valuable to have you here. We heard from Mr. Bates that when he was asked, why has this taken 20 years, he said it's because the Post Office had the ear of politicians. Is he right?
Well, you'd have to ask the various politicians. I mean, clearly, I work with the Post Office very closely. I meet with Nick Reed on a regular basis. Are we challenging in our relationship with the Post Office? Absolutely, and I expect any of my predecessors
to do that too. Did we over the years, Minister, is the question.
Sorry?
Did we over the past 20 years?
I don't think we've been sufficiently challenging, no. I mean, I think this wouldn't have happened, or it would have been resolved earlier if we'd been more challenging earlier. But you know, we all make mistakes, Mark. You know, these are challenging things to do. I'm not going to blame any one of my predecessors specifically, but clearly we could have done better.
Yeah, and we know that, you know, in any group of people, postmasters included, there will be some who will have done some wrong, and there will have been a number of cases that will have had to come on a regular basis. But these were absolutely multiplied, weren't they? So we heard from Mr. Reed that at no point did anybody in the Post Office sort of question why the numbers of postmasters being convicted has suddenly started to increase. Why do you think that was unchallenged for so long?
Well, if you look at there's an interesting graph, and I can share the research with you. It's some legal research on it. There was about 5 prosecutions a year happening prior to 1999, and then it suddenly shot up on the introduction of Horizon to 55 average, something like that, and stayed there until the court case that the GFSA
brought
forward.
Businesses. If we saw something of that nature happening, that would trigger a question.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You can all speculate what happened in the Post Office. Neither was there at the time. My guesstimate on that would be, well, isn't this system great? We're suddenly identifying all these people that are stealing money off us. Isn't that great? And I think that would have been perhaps understandable at the time. But then as the evidence came in, or the outcry became louder for people like Alan Bates and Joe Hamilton and others, the question should have been asked and answered.
Do you accept that there was been a pretty unequal relationship between the postmaster and the Post Office? We heard about this big trusted brand that could do no wrong. There were huge resources behind the Post Office, and the postmasters themselves were little people. How can we prevent that kind of relationship occurring in any organisation that government's involved in the future?
I think this happens right across the piece, and I haven't got all the answers to that, but it's something we need to look at very carefully. And I think there was inequality of arms between postmasters and Post Office. I think the inequality of arms between in the legal process, in the courts, and there's evidence of this. Paul Marshall, an important barrister who's worked in this particular area, has identified this, that courts often side with the larger entity. It's rather than the person who's trying to defend themselves. And I think there are questions to answer right across the piece.
Right, and if I might ask you a few questions about the legislation that you're bringing forward, that we know is urgently needed. But the first question is, you know, there will have been some amongst those members who had done wrong and should have been convicted. How, under your new proposed legislation, are you going to make certain that those who did do something wrong aren't necessarily exonerated, and they don't receive some compensation inappropriately from the taxpayer?
Well, that's where we want to be, but we've been clear on this. I think there is a significant chance that some people who are actually guilty of something will get compensation. And I think we should be honest about that. And I think
it's just a risk that we need to take.
A risk we need to take. As we said before, lesser of two evils. I think, as Joe Hamilton said in her evidence, it's the only way. I think it's imperfect, But the reality is, yes, we'll try and put mitigations in place. Very happy to hear from this committee about different mitigations we can put in place. I think we've committed to having a statement that people have to sign to say they weren't guilty of theft or other things that they may have been accused of or found guilty of. But I think it's imperfect.
And what would you say to those who've said to us that overturning a conviction without a full process devalues the acquittal of those who went through the courts? Do you accept that?
Well, again, Jo Hamilton said that she didn't feel her case would have been devalued and what she did, because I think we all should. I mean, it's an incredible story, and it was a pleasure to meet Jo some weeks ago. So I hope people don't feel that. I don't think that's right. I think people, if anything, the admiration for people who've gone through this has skyrocketed given the dramatisation. So I don't feel that's the case. I think people can see there's this massive, widespread miscarriage of justice. It's not just the scale of it, it's the depth of it. It's the scale of it in terms of the number of people, but it's the depth of it in terms of the impact on people's lives. And I think that's what really came through in that documentary, in that dramatisation.
And we acknowledge that you're moving as fast as you can, but what do you make of the Scottish First Minister's announcement that overturning convictions for post office scandal victims in Scotland will happen immediately?
I mean, I welcome it. We're very keen to work with our counterparts in those jurisdictions, Northern Ireland as well, to make sure we're trying to do this on a UK-wide basis and be consistent.
Okay, and how can the government make sure that the criminal records of those who were convicted are expunged as quickly as possible?
Well, that's what we've got a draft legislation to do, and it's complex. We had meetings on it yesterday, and we'll have meetings, and I spoke to the Justice Secretary about it last night. It's not straightforward, but there's some eminent people on this committee that will no doubt get the views of how we do that, but we're keen to do it as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I welcome, Minister, the fact that you are willing to consult widely as to how best we achieve that, and my committee is happy to help you with that. But can we get one thing clear, that this is an exceptional step, isn't it?
It is.
To deal with a wholly exceptional circumstance.
Yeah.
And will the government make it clear in however way the registration is framed and prevented that this is not and could never be used as a precedent for undermining the basic principle of the independence of the judiciary when they're considering both criminal and civil cases? That's fundamental, isn't it?
Absolutely, and you have that commitment from me. Anything you think we need to do to set that out, the reasons why we're doing this, the fact that this is suboptimal, the fact that this is the least worst option route we're taking, and any way we can define this to exclude the possibility of this having to do this again, interfere with the judicial process. I'm all ears and very keen to work with you to do that.
It'd be fair also to say that the decision to proceed by this exceptional route doesn't imply any criticism of the judiciary or the way they've handled matters on the information available to them at the time.
Absolutely, not at all. And it does illustrate the inequality of arms, as I say, in court-based processes, and we saw that in the dramatisation and in the real world. That's exactly what did happen. So, but yes, no criticism whatsoever.
Used to have a great system called legal aid. But, Ian Lavery.
With regard to compensation, Minister, we've heard this morning, you've been in for most of the session. There's a massive issue which seems to be outstanding, perhaps ignored, and that's the fact that sub-postmasters and the sub-post officers are like a family business, and we're looking at compensation for the victims only. We've had women widowed, we've had children losing their father or their mother as a result of this. We've had people separated, never to see each other again. We've had kids who've had to move communities. What will the government do to make sure that fair and rightful compensation is given to the people other than the victims, but part of the sub-postmasters family, as it were?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. I mean, in my own constituency, I've got Sam Harrison, who was the postmaster at Norton near Helmsley, and who sadly passed away last May, who was part of the 555, and I've spoken to her, one of her sons, and heartbreaking situations, and what they've been through, as well as the fact that now they lost their mum. Compensation, of course, will be paid to the family, to their estate, which then flows through to those individuals that way. I think there's two questions right here, and again, we're talking to the advisory board about this, and there's been absolutely vital, I think, in getting to the place we are today. The advisory board does a fantastic job, and it covers all 3 schemes, and also includes it, as well as Lord Arbuthnot, Kevin Jones and Richard Moorhead, Chris Hodges, that's been the chair. But they've talked about family members, impact on family members. It's something we are talking to them about. I'll be honest, and I always seek to be honest with this committee, there's a nervousness around that, in that directly compensating family members, in that you could say this for any compensation scheme we run with contaminated blood. You could say this about some of the banking scandals, all those things. All those families are affected, of course, but it would hugely increase the scope and complexity of compensation schemes, and of course the cost of the compensation schemes. So it wouldn't be an easy thing to do, to open it up to family members, but I understand the point you're making.
Anthony Higginbottom.
I think it's me.
Oh, Anthony.
Right. 2 Anthonys next door to each other. Minister, thank you for sitting through and being here. Can I just ask, with the question that I ended with Lord Arbuthnot, why are we still using Horizon?
Again, that's the least worst option as well. I mean, this is one of the biggest IT systems, IT networks, I think, in Europe, and if not the world. So it's a significant thing to replace. It's being replaced. I think the cost so far of replacing it is around £270 million. It's being rebuilt, and we want to get people off Horizon as soon as possible. But the system they're using now, as far as we're aware, is far more reliable than previous versions. Some of the difficulties have been resolved, I think, or all the difficulties have been resolved in terms that caused the problems in the past. But it's something that the Post Office wants to move away from, and that is something that we are funding, to help the Post Office with funding to be able to do that.
Can I just push you on this, because that is what everyone said at the beginning. Here is the biggest and best system. I think it was said in Europe, isn't it fantastic? We're going to make it easier for those who work in the Post Office, and look at where we are now. You've now got the people who messed up the system, that's putting it politely, still running the operating system that those who work in the Post Office are using. So, I mean, I guess that it all comes back to trust. It all comes back to confidence in the system. You can't be that confident that people out there working in the Post Office at the moment are confident and trust the system they're using. Indeed, even in the run-up to this inquiry, I think a number of us went out and have spoken to sub-postmasters and mistresses across the country. I don't really think I spoke to a single one out of the 10 or 15 that I spoke to, both past and present, who had any confidence in that system. So we've been here before, we've heard about IBM, we've heard about Amazon. These are all falling through the cracks and not being implemented, these new systems, these new organisations to try and run them. Why aren't we expediting that? Because 25 years should be enough time to change the system altogether.
Well, that's the reason it's been rebuilt. We're moving off it. I mean, but as you know, IT projects are notoriously slower than expected and more costly than expected, and this is no different. But you can't just rip a system out overnight. You have to rebuild it. It has to be right. It has to be fit for purpose. You have to make sure it doesn't carry the same flaws as previous versions. Now, I think we're a lot further on in terms of IT capability, in terms of deployment these kind of technologies than we were 25 years ago. So there's every reason to expect that it's a much more robust system, and it is being piloted currently in a number of branches, but these things do take time.
What safeguards do you think you can or ought to provide then for someone who doesn't have confidence in the system that they're currently using because of historical reasons? So do you say, actually, rather than going through the Horizon helpline, that your department should have actually a dedicated helpline for people to be able to contact you if they are not confident with the response and relationship they're getting from the organisation that's running their operating system?
I think you've got to be careful that we don't end up running the Post Office. That's not what we do, not what we want to do, not what we've got the expertise to do. So you've got to have confidence in the management to do that. That's their responsibility, and they've also got the responsibility to put in the checks and balances needed to make sure this system is fit for purpose.
Can I just draw you back to Joe Hamilton's comments about the chronology of payments? That actually, we can talk about all of the compensation schemes. That actually, it's quite important to make sure that we're getting it right in terms of those who have been waiting the longest, are making sure their systems are being addressed. Given what you've heard this morning, how do you think you can go back and help speed up the process, deal with the bureaucracy? We've heard Mr. Reid say what he's going to do. What can you do from your position to speed up the timelines here?
Well, certainly, I might hand over to Carl here, because we look after the DBT looks after the GLO scheme, and we've made commitments in terms of turnaround, in terms of responses to claims that have been submitted. We're very keen to do that. The 40 working days rule in 90% of cases. We're determined to slim down the bureaucracy. We're working with the advisory board. They've made recommendations or making recommendations how we can expedite payments, which we're keen to do. We've implemented some things already, not least the fixed sum award across the 2 schemes. But Carl, you may want to comment.
No, thank you. I certainly think that the 75k fixed sum offer should help us with maybe up to a third of the claimants within the GLO cohort, looking at the data that we have received so far. And definitely we have a strong record from the impact of the 600,000 fixed sum offer for the overturned conviction, so I hope that will help. I wanted to put on record the fact that we have had 59 claims into the department within that cohort that you were mentioning earlier, the 478 claimants. So we aren't sitting there with a large number of unprocessed claims. We designed this process, frankly, trying to learn lessons from some of the criticisms of the Horizon Shortfall Scheme by working closely with claimants' lawyers. So we employed Freeths to help us design this scheme, and we included within that design steps such as the request for medical advice, forensic accountancy advice, and so on from experts. So we are delivering a scheme, having consulted the claimants' lawyers, that works within that process. But we do need to go further and faster. I totally recognise that. But so far, we've had 59 claims in so far, and we have given out offers of 44, of which 29 have been accepted. So much more to do, and a lot of claims to come, but it's not that they are sitting on our desk at the moment unprocessed.
Yeah, I understand the need to consult lawyers to make sure the system works, but I've never found a lawyer doing anything quickly in my life. So, I mean, this is slightly the problem here. Sorry, my respect. Apologies, I don't mean to be rude about previous witnesses, especially with the good work you're doing, but perhaps you could possibly provide timelines on this, because I don't think you are hitting those targets of 40 days. I don't think you are seeing the delivery of the compensation that people are asking for in the times that you are suggesting, and I don't know if it's possible for you to provide this committee with that evidence so that we can actually not only scrutinise it but publish it as well.
Could I quickly come back on that? Because
Please.
Following the previous hearing where we came and gave evidence a while ago, we have been writing on a quarterly basis to the chair of the committee to provide data across all of the compensation schemes. And following your recommendations, we have gone further and are now publishing that data on a monthly basis. The most recent report was issued yesterday, which included those statistics that I just gave you. So we're happy to provide further information on top of that. And we will, I think, next month be assessing whether we are delivering against that 90% target for 40 working days. That is quite a stretching target, but we're happy to give you an update on that particular statistic.
The key thing is the target has got to take aim at check out the door.
Absolutely. Yes. Can I just make the point that, again, if you look at all the schemes, they are very slow at the start. But that's the way these schemes are, because it takes a while to start filling the pipeline and coming through. But if you look at the HSS, 85% of claimants had full and final settlements of the offers that have been made, the ones that applied in the original timescale. It's not as if people sit around doing nothing. If you look at the people on the independent panel and the HSS, they include people like Lord Garnier, 8 eminent KCs, 6 forensic accountants.
Well, I've been a minister long enough to know that very often words are used that, like processing and settlement offered, and there are all kinds of words that we can invent to basically give a summary
money in the bank
of a
Absolutely.
Stage of the process. The key thing that we need basically is the target for when is the check out the door. Basically,
well, if you look
that's
at
what
31,
we've got to measure against.
The 31 overturned convictions, 29 of those checks are in the bank of the intended
So we will
recipient.
now, I think, use the check in the bank target as a way of
Very
judging
happy to do
progress.
that.
Mind if I just ask
Please,
two final ones, Minister? Who should be picking up the bill here for this? Fujitsu or the taxpayer? I feel that might be an obvious answer. And then can I just, the second part to this is that if Fujitsu, as you've heard in this morning's session, is going to offer, they feel there's a moral obligation, they feel that they may offer some money in the future, are we then opening up another scheme? And how is that scheme going to work to make sure that that compensation is effectively reaching all of the people who have been impacted and, of course, successfully processed by
Yes. We're not
August
opening
this year.
We're not opening a new scheme. What do you
do with the compensation?
Well, that money should go back to pay for the taxpayer what they've had to fund. It is £1 billion. It's not being funded by the Post Office. That's why it doesn't sit on their accounts, because the taxpayer's picking up the tab. So any contribution from fiduciary, and I welcome the commitment made today and this conversation we've had previously between officials, and we think it's a timing thing in terms of maximising the contribution to the taxpayer in terms of when we have that proper discussion about contribution to the bill. But it's a very significant bill. It may north of £1 billion. Our suspicion is that it will. So that's a very, very significant contribution the taxpayer is making, and it's very welcome. We should thank the taxpayer for doing that. And but also we should expect people who have contributed to this scandal to contribute financially.
Yeah, thank you. We bring in Mr. Lavery and then Anthony.
Minister, do you think there was ever a perception that the inward investment from Fujitsu, also from Japan, was that great that the government took a back seat and didn't want to interfere with this at the very beginning for fear of losing inward investment? And secondly, you can correct us if I'm wrong, I'm only understanding that the government always had one person on the board, at least one person on the board of the Post Office all the way through. Was that government nomination and nominee, did they not come forward with any information with regard to what was happening at any stage during this whole period?
Well, listen, we welcome anybody who wants to invest in this country, as long as they're a bona fide actor. And has that influenced any decision I've made or any conversation I've had with any of my colleagues or with the Secretary of State in terms of whether how we go about getting Fujitsu to contribute, for example? Never. That has never been a factor, and never would it be. So no, we purely think, for the 15 months I've been in my particular role, it's a timing thing. We want to establish exactly who is guilty and the extent of their contribution to the scandal, and then make sure that the money, the contribution, is commensurate with the contribution they've made towards the scandal in the first place. In terms of who knew what from the government on the board, we have a representative from UKGI who sits on the board currently. I don't know about that relationship in the past. I don't know what they knew or they didn't know in terms of the relevant person from government. I don't know if Carl can add any information to that, but I do think it's right that we don't try and duplicate what the inquiry is doing. It's a very complex set of circumstances. It should be given time to report, which it should do complete at the end of this year, hopefully report soon after. Then we'll know who knew what, or should have known what and should have done what, and we can then assign blame accordingly.
No, I agree with that analysis. I don't think it's factually correct that there was a government representative throughout that period from 1999 through to now. I think at one point Post Office was part of Royal Mail Group, and I don't believe there was a government representative on the board of Royal Mail. I couldn't tell you factually when that changed and when the shareholder executive first put someone onto the board that oversaw the work of the Post Office, but I think it's that sort of factual distinction I would make.
Okay, thank you. Anthony.
Thank you, Chair.
Just briefly.
Minister, you heard all the previous evidence. You'll have heard Nick Reed talk about the final compensation bill, and he didn't think $1 billion was accurate. You've just said probably north of $1 billion. How are your figures so different?
You have to ask. I mean, I know the facts. I mean, I can't speak for Nick Reed, and it's something that we're picking the tab of. So probably we're taking a closer look at it. It's a maximum figure that £1 billion currently specified, and clearly we have got, having the taxpayer picking up the tab of this, we've got to calculate what we think the impact will be, and that figure at the moment is set at a maximum of £1 billion. Now, what we did last week in terms of the overturning the convictions will have a massively material effect on that, because it opens the door for compensation for a significant increase in the number of people that will come forward and have access to compensation. I had an email myself only I think yesterday or the day before from somebody saying they've overturned the convictions already, they were never intending to enter this process. By doing what we've done in terms of the fixed sum award, for example, they're now entering the process, so it will happen very quickly. And I think the combination of the fixed sum award and the mass overturning of convictions will have a significant impact on the number of people that receive compensation, and quite rightly too.
So do you think there is a naivety, a lack of curiosity in the post office management about the compensation bill?
Did I come in on the factual point around what Mr. Reid said? He was referring to what was included in the accounts that were published at the end of last year, which preceded the announcement last week. So the assessment that was done at that point was on the basis of the low number of people that had come forward, which is what has driven the policy change that we've been discussing with the Minister since before Christmas that led to the announcement last week.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't impact on the post office accounts. It's as simple as that. It's a taxpayer's...
Does that result in a lack of curiosity on the part of the post office management?
Well,
they don't need to be concerned with it.
It's probably a question not for me. I think, to me, it's not relevant in terms of the major issue here, which is accelerating compensation. It makes no difference in terms of getting compensation out the door, whether they're curious or not. I think it's incumbent on all of us involved in this process to try and accelerate every part of the process. What I did welcome from Nick Reid was his commitment to look again at the process and streamline it, because there was some very concerning evidence from Neil Hudgell about some of the complexities, some of the delays in responses. That shouldn't happen. There should be enough resources there to respond quickly to any simple query, simple question, to try and resolve these matters as quickly as possible. So certainly welcome that.
I accept your point about, it doesn't impact the compensation, but does it not talk to the culture in the post office that sub-postmasters are still dealing with that same organisation that is not interested in the final provision, that is not curious about? You heard the questions and the answers throughout the whole morning.
Yeah, it may do. I don't feel that's the thing that's holding back people getting access to compensation. I think the bureaucracy, red tape, whatever you want to call it, is an inevitable fact of life in our lives. We want to minimise it wherever possible. Where we can cut that red tape, make it easier to get access to compensation, we will do everything we can to do that.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of questions to wrap up. You'll have heard Joe Hamilton referring to the £75,000 upfront payment to settle cases as out of touch and wouldn't even cover the interest on what's been stolen from them by the Post Office Limited. What's your response to that?
It depends on the level of your claim. I think in something like Joe Hamilton's case, clearly that would be the case, but that isn't what the fixed sum award is all about. It's saying to people with lower value claims, if you've got a claim potentially for £10,000, as somebody may have, £75,000 quite a lot of money for those people, and we'll take them out the queue, because all those people will have to go through a process of compiling and then submitting a claim which is then responded to. All those people can come out the queue. I think Alan's question earlier, when he said, what will happen to people who've already accepted 30,000, for example, they'll all get topped up to £75,000. So in the GLO, the minimum you'll get is £75,000. It takes lots of people out of the queue who would have been accessing lower level claims. It does not help people like Joe, if I can call her Joe Hamilton, only to the extent there are fewer people then who are accessing the full assessment process.
So you'd accept then that in cases like Joe Hamilton's, the process has been much too slow to date and does now need speeding up?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let me just check a couple of the recommendations that we've made as a committee with you, because the committee has been working on this for some time. So in 2022, we obviously demanded that the government ensure that the 555 were compensated fully on the same basis as other victims. The GLO scheme was set up, and you've been able to give the committee this afternoon a goal of settling those claims by the end of August. Is that correct?
7th of August, I think I said. But no, you're right. And of your 18 recommendations, I think we implemented 12 and implemented others in different ways. And indeed, in GLO, I stood up in Parliament myself as a backbencher and called for the same thing as you call for.
We're going to go through them. So the second recommendation that we made is we recommended that government urgently put in place an independent intermediary body to support victims of the Horizon scandal in seeking redress. That was rejected by the government, and today we have heard evidence that there may be hundreds more victims out there who haven't had the confidence to come forward. We have also heard the Chief Executive of the Post Office say that he agrees that the guidance for the HSS scheme is going to need some revision. Do you think government was wrong to reject that recommendation of the committee last year?
No, the CCRC plays that role as an independent body, of course, and people can go to the CCRC. The CCRC themselves wrote to all those with convictions and asked them to come forward. Citizens' advice also was available to people. So I think...
Have you ever tried to get hold of citizens' advice?
That's a slightly different... one for a different inquiry, perhaps. But I think the biggest issue we have, well, I don't think the committee did recommend what we've done last week, which is unprecedented, which is that we think when we looked at all this, and to do this quickly, we looked at expediting the process within the CCRC, different ways we could do that, increasing resources, everything we looked at would have taken years to deliver. So we came down on the very significant and unprecedented step, unprecedented step of taking a mass overturning convictions route.
We also recommended that government set stretching targets to address the backlog, and the Right Honourable Member for Sutton and Cheam, Mr Scully, set out an ambition of 100% of initial offers under the historic shortfall scheme to be made by the end of 2022, and the Post Office Chief Exec committed to making initial compensation offers to about 95% of claimants by the end of 2022. Those targets have been missed.
And I apologise for us missing them. You know, there's no shortage of appetite or willingness to do it. These things take longer than we expect. I've seen every compensation scheme I've ever worked with as a backbencher, and there's no difference with this one as a minister. It's more complex than we probably initially anticipate. But is there ambition to get that money out the door as quickly as possible? That's our number one priority. Is our ambition to make sure it is fair and seen to be fair? That's our number two priority, and that's what the advisory board is there for. Is it our ambition is it our priority to make sure people are held to account for what's gone wrong? Absolutely, and that's what the inquiry is there for.
Well, look, you've told the committee today that you thought the progress in making payments and redress was much too slow. That you are going to bring forward a bill to try and speed it up. You're going to look at whether that is going to be a draft bill so that it could go through pre-legislative scrutiny. And you've been really clear with the committee that your goal for checks in the bank is around August time. So thank you very much indeed for your evidence today, both of you. Thank you very much for your patience with our overrunning session today. That concludes our session. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.